What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, your electricity bill could be a fraction of what it is? And the technology to make that happen was already built, tested, and proven decades ago. What if that invention was so efficient, so revolutionary, that the people in power felt threatened by it, and quietly buried it before the world ever got a chance to see it work? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. And by the end of this video, you are going to be furious. If you're new here, subscribe right now, because this channel covers the stories they don't want you to find. And this one is going to shake you. The year is 1973. The world is in chaos. Arab oil exporting nations have just imposed an embargo on countries that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Overnight, oil prices quadrupled. Petrol stations ran dry. Governments panicked. Entire economies ground to a halt. In the United Kingdom, the crisis hit hard. Factories closed. Power cuts became routine. Prime Minister Edward Heath introduced a 3-day working week to conserve energy. People were literally sitting in the dark. And it was in that darkness, in that atmosphere of desperation and urgency, that one man at a Scottish university looked at the ocean and had an idea that would change everything. His name was Stephen Salter. He was an engineer at the University of Edinburgh. Not a billionaire, not a government insider, just a brilliant, obsessive man who refused to accept that humanity was stuck depending on oil. He spent his evenings studying wave motion. The ocean, he realized, was an almost limitless source of kinetic energy, constantly moving, constantly crashing, always there. The question was, how do you harvest it? How do you turn the chaotic power of the sea into clean, predictable electricity? Most people would have given up at that question. Stephen Salter went to work. He started, of all places, by observing a toilet cistern. Watching the way the float inside a cistern would bob and tilt as water changed levels, he had a flash of insight. What if a floating device could be designed to absorb the rocking motion of ocean waves and convert that movement into electricity? He began designing, he refined his concept, he tested it, and then in 1974, just 1 year after the oil crisis began, he unveiled what would become one of the most extraordinary inventions in the history of energy engineering. He called it the Edinburgh Duck. The world would come to know it as Salter's Duck. Here is what made it so remarkable. The device had a pear-shaped cam-like floating body, wide at the front, tapered at the back, that was designed to perfectly match the circular motion of ocean waves. When a wave passed, the duck's nose would dip into it, absorbing the energy with extraordinary precision. Inside the duck, that motion drove a series of gyroscopes, which in turn powered hydraulic pumps, which generated electricity. The cable running from the device would carry that power to shore. Simple in concept, genius in execution. And the efficiency numbers, they were almost unbelievable. In controlled laboratory tests, Salter's duck could stop 90% of incoming wave motion and convert 90% of that captured energy into electricity. Let that sink in. Most industrial generators operate at around 30 to 40% efficiency. Some renewable technologies struggle to hit 20% under real-world conditions. Here was a device achieving 90% in tests. Engineers across the industry were stunned. The physics was sound. The mechanism worked. The British government, facing a nation terrified of another oil shock, took notice, and so in 1975, the UK Labour government officially launched the National Wave Energy Programme. Funding began to flow. Teams of researchers across the country were put to work. Multiple devices were proposed and tested, but Salter's Duck stood apart from all of them. It was consistently the most efficient, the most elegant, the most promising. The University of Edinburgh team, working with modest resources, continued to refine the design. They built larger models. They ran tests in the world's first multi-directional wave tank, a facility that Salter himself had designed and built in 1977, another innovation that the field of engineering still uses today. Test after test confirmed what the early data had shown. This device worked. It worked extraordinarily well. The UK coastline, particularly the waters off Scotland and Wales, contains some of the most powerful wave resources on the planet. Studies at the time estimated that wave energy alone could meet a substantial portion of Britain's electricity needs. Environmentalists were excited, scientists were excited. Even some politicians began talking about a future where Britain would no longer depend on foreign oil, a future where the ocean itself powered the nation, a future that was, by all measurable evidence, within reach. But then something changed, and this is where the story gets dark. The Wave Energy Program was not administered by a neutral scientific body. Its funding was filtered through an organization called the Energy Technology Support Unit, and that unit operated under the authority of the UK Atomic Energy Authority. Read that again. The agency controlling Britain's investment in renewable wave energy was run by people whose entire careers, whose entire institutional identity was tied to nuclear power. These were not impartial reviewers. These were competitors, and as Salter's duck continued to perform, as cost projections began to fall, as the technology edged closer to economic viability, the nuclear establishment began to get nervous. Professor Salter himself later described what happened next. He recalled that when the program manager projected that, with continued development, the duck could generate electricity at a cost of 3 pence per kilowatt hour, a price that would have been genuinely competitive with conventional sources, that manager was excluded from the next major meeting of the key committee, not reassigned, not questioned, simply excluded. Removed from the room where decisions were made. The message was clear. Progress on wave energy was unwelcome. And then came the numbers. The Energy Technology Support Unit produced a cost analysis of Salter's duck that concluded the technology was far too expensive to be viable. The figures they used suggested the duck would produce electricity at a cost 10 times higher than the actual projections. 10 times, not a rounding error, not a minor miscalculation, a factor of 10. And this analysis, this catastrophically wrong analysis, was presented to the government as the authoritative assessment. Years later, according to sworn testimony before the House of Parliament, the error was identified and confirmed. The cost of energy production had been miscalculated by a factor of 10, but by then it was too late. On the 19th of March, 1982, in a closed meeting, the details of which remain classified, the UK Wave Energy Programme was officially shut down. The committee members in that meeting were drawn largely from the nuclear and fossil fuel industries. No public announcement, no parliamentary debate, no independent review. One day the programme existed, the next day it did not. Professor Salter's team received the news and was told to stop. One of the programme's senior researchers later said he resigned because he was asked to write what he called the obituary of wave power. He refused. He could not bring himself to declare dead something he knew was alive. The duck never went to sea. That is perhaps the most haunting detail of this entire story. After years of laboratory testing, after breakthrough after breakthrough, after a device that by all scientific measures should have been one of the great technological achievements of the 20th century, it never touched the open ocean. The final sea trial, the experiment that would have proven everything at full scale, never happened. Funding was gone. The team was dispersed. Stephen Salter spent years trying to revive interest, fighting through bureaucratic indifference and institutional resistance, watching as the world continued to burn oil and coal while his invention sat in storage. And here is the question that should keep you up at night. What would the world look like today if that program had not been killed in 1982? The UK Wave Energy Programme had already received £15 million in funding by that point. Nuclear power research, by contrast, was receiving £200 million per year. 200 million versus 15 million. And even at that tiny fraction of the investment, Salter's duck was performing. What if the same resources that went into nuclear development had gone into wave energy? What if Britain had deployed arrays of Salter's ducks along its coastline through the 1980s and 1990s? What if that technology had spread to other countries the way wind and solar eventually did? We cannot know, because the experiment was never allowed to run. The tragedy does not end in 1982, it echoes forward. Today, In 2026, wave energy remains one of the most underdeveloped renewable sectors on the planet. Dozens of designs have been proposed and tested over the decades since the duck was killed. None have reached large-scale commercial deployment. None. The ocean, that vast, ceaseless engine of kinetic energy, remains almost entirely untapped as a power source. The world invested billions into solar, billions into wind. Wave energy has received a fraction of that attention, and many researchers believe it is directly because the early program was so thoroughly destroyed that the field never recovered its momentum. Salter himself never stopped believing. Into his 80s, he continued to refine concepts and advocate for wave energy. He proposed new designs for marine cloud brightening, using ocean-based devices to reflect sunlight and combat climate change. He received an MBE from the Crown in 2004 for his services to engineering, but the duck, his masterpiece, remained unbuilt at scale. Stephen Salter died on the 23rd of February 2024. He never saw his invention change the world the way it should have. And so here we are, standing at the edge of a climate crisis that scientists have been warning about for 50 years, scrambling to build enough solar panels and wind turbines fast enough to prevent temperatures from rising beyond the point of no return, paying energy bills that strain household budgets, watching governments argue over carbon targets while oil companies post record profits. And somewhere in the archives of the University of Edinburgh, in the engineering papers of a man the world largely forgot, sits the blueprint for a device that could produce electricity at 90% efficiency from the one energy source that never stops. The ocean doesn't need subsidies. The waves don't take days off. They don't have a supply chain. They don't have a lobby. But someone did have a lobby, and in 1982 that lobby won. The story of Salter's duck is not just a story about one invention. It is a story about power. Who has it, who protects it, and what they are willing to destroy to keep it. It is a story about what happens when the most important questions in the world get answered by committees of people with the most to lose from the answers. And it is a story that is still unfolding, because the decision made in that closed meeting in March of 1982 is still shaping the energy choices of every person alive today. Think about that the next time you pay your electricity bill. Think about the ocean outside your window or 1,000 miles away, crashing endlessly against some coast, moving, always moving, full of energy that has been going nowhere useful for 40 years. Think about a duck that never got to swim. If this video opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, share it. Not for the channel, for the conversation. Because the only way stories like this stop being buried is if enough people refuse to let them stay buried. Subscribe if you want more. And ask yourself how many other inventions are sitting in archives right now, waiting for someone to finally ask why they disappeared.